an introduction into who I am as a person, and then we can go through questions. I get asked a lot just about like who I am as a person, so I've kind of come up with a way to articulate my story in sort of terms of coming out, which is a distinctly Western idea. It's sort of a colonizer thing to have to come out anyways, because there's in a lot of cultures that predated Westernism, there was queer identities, and there was like not even a need for a language of coming out because it was just a part of the culture, which is something that I'm learning in my own graduate studies at the moment. So I digress, but we can talk about that later if you folks want. But because I am in a Western context, I've kind of structured my story around my coming out narrative in a way to kind of give inroads to conversation. So we'll start out with that, if that's all right with you folks. Quick question, do I have to leave my mask on to talk? Gosh darn it. I don't mind, I just have asthma. It's like a whole thing. So with all of that preamble out of the way, my name is Leowt. That's what you can find me as online. If you should want to talk to me afterwards, my digital door is always open for conversation, so don't feel afraid to hit me up if you want to. I am a small business owner here in Olean. My wife and I own a salon. We have 5 children, and adding to our sort of level of queerness, meaning queer meaning existed beyond the binary. My wife is Puerto Rican. All of our children are biracial, and we have a neurodivergent child, and we have a special needs cat. So like really, you couldn't get a more queer household than we have, which is funny because we live in this environment around us, right? So by day, I am a hairdresser. By night, I am a graduate student studying queer theology and interreligious studies. I also host a podcast and an online discussion series called Conversations Official, which is structured around the idea of having intersectional conversations about life, belief, and the middle of the two of them where they clash. So I've kind of invested my whole life and found a lot of framework for my life through the lens of queerness. And that's kind of where my story jumps off. When I was younger, I grew up in a conservative Christian household. My dad was a pastor through a small evangelical denomination. And when I say I was in it to win it, I mean, I was double fisting the evangelical Kool-Aid. I was so pumped to be a part of the church. I went to youth group every time it was open, and I really understood that I thought that I was going to be a pastor. Like that's my first understanding of calling early in life. When I say understanding of calling, I mean from the time I was 5, I thought that that's what my calling in life was going to be. My vocation was to be a pastor. Fast forward to when I'm in college, and my very first day of college, a soccer teammate of mine at Pitt Bradford came out to me. And she came out to me because she thought I was gay. And for me, that was the bell that couldn't be unrung. Up until that point in my life, I understood myself to be cisgendered, heterosexual, and categorically evangelical Christian. And then the bell was rung, and it couldn't become unrung, right? So my 5 years in college, my 4 years, which I managed to cram into 5, I'm sure none of you know what that's about. You guys are all going to get through like right in 4 years and never change your major, which I did like 5 times. But you're also allowed to laugh. I am intentionally trying to be funny, so you're allowed. But so in my 5 years of college, that was pretty much my process of coming out. And there's layers to one's coming out story, right? So for me, I had to come out to myself, and then I had to come out to God because I was a deeply religious person. And then I came out to the world around me in sort of concentric circles that move further away from my close friends to, peers, to professors, to family, however it is, there's layers of it. So I came out at the very end of my college career, between my junior and senior year of a pastoral ministry degree at a conservative evangelical college. I came out as a lesbian. It went about as well as you would expect it to go. You know what I mean? I was removed from any and all public leadership positions. I was placed in a single, pretty much like excommunicated. It was pretty wild for a while. And things were pretty rough with my family at that point. So I kind of was just sleeping on people's couches in New York City and trying to figure out what to do with my life next, I ended up finding my way back to Olean, New York, because it was just too expensive to live in the city. And I thought for sure I was going to die a slow social death. Like, I was confident that I was not going to survive this area, right? Not because of any one person. I just thought I would wither away and die. But slowly but surely, like, I have a real life here, you know. I met my now partner, Elle, who is just the most amazing person I've ever met. When I met her, she started to notice that I was like, I wore girls' clothes, but I was really like awkward and uncomfortable. And one day she was like, why do you wear girls' clothes? And I was like, I don't know, because I always had. And she kind of called me out on it in the most loving way possible. She's like, why do you do this? Like, and she's like, you could just wear boys' clothes. And that was like another bell that couldn't be unrung, right? And thus began what I'll refer to as my like sort of odyssey of gender. Not too long after that, I came out as a trans male. I began medically transitioning about 8 years ago. For those of you who aren't familiar, you can transition socially. You can transition medically. Socially just refers to sort of the, like, any non-medical aspect, like your name, how you dress, the way you relate to the world, how you explain who you are in the world. Those are sort of the external factors. And I did that. I changed my name. My partner gave me my name because she always called me Leo, always from the very beginning. Her and my kids never used my birth name just because they're like, ew, that doesn't seem right. So in a lot of ways, they brought me into being, which is something that I have, the Taharas and my wife to thank for. So I hope she's watching on there. So I came out as a trans male. After being out for about 3 years, I kind of realized that something still didn't feel like it fit. And so as I sort of began to press up on that discomfort I felt, I realized that I wasn't male, right? That is not to say that trans people are not what they say they are. That is just to say that I wasn't male. I came to understand myself as someone who was equal parts, not equal parts, who was someone who was fully masculine and fully feminine simultaneously. So I came out as non-binary very publicly, in a very, very public way, about 2 years ago. There was some protests going on in town in and around the public lynching of George Floyd, and we had a Black Lives Matter protest that I happened to attend. We had over 300 people there, which is a fantastic ratio considering we only have 13,000 in our town. And I made a video on Facebook that ended up going viral after that, where I basically just said that religion and orientation, religion and queerness are not enemies, just as religion and blackness are not enemies. And any church that preaches anything that's anti-queer or anti-black is unacceptable and not biblical. That video got 10,000 views before the day was over, which, if you're keeping track of the population, that means literally almost numerically, almost the whole population of this town saw my video, which is pretty wild because I still don't have any sense of anonymity in this town. But in that video and in the resulting interviews that people did with me, I decided, you know what, I am non-binary and I'm going to assert that. Yeah.
You just dropped money.
Oh, thank you. That's for my day job. But yeah, so I decided if people are going to write about me in the newspaper and people are going to make videos about me, then they're going to use my pronouns. And my pronouns are they, them. Because I am, as I said before, both masculine and feminine, both male and female, coexisting in one body, not at war with each other. And it took me a while to understand that because our society, most of our life is structured through a binary of you are either this or this. And I realized I wasn't half of a person when I felt masculine. I wasn't half of a person when I felt feminine. I was the whole person at all points, and all of those were integrated in my person. And that's when I came out as non-binary. And then shortly after that, my fourth coming out was as someone who had a stake and a voice in the religious field. At this point in my life, a lot of people don't know that I went to church to be a pastor, don't know that I have this history in the church. But when I saw no other religious voices speaking up around the injustice surrounding police brutality, I said, you know what, like, I've got a degree, let's throw on a collar and hit the streets. And if no one else is going to speak up, I have absolutely as much claim to sort of religion as anybody else does. So I reasserted myself as a person who was religiously invested, you know. So I always like to say I had like 4 coming out stories because I'm just like a sucker for coming out, you know what I mean? But I think a big part of my story, and I kind of love telling, Sonia has to have heard my story like at least like 6 or 7 times now. And every time it's different because I'm just evolving as a person. So welcome to the 2022 version. Who knows what 2023 will be. But a lot of my journey right now, especially with like my studies and just my life in general, is where I'm at in life right now is realizing that the binary exists, but it's a social construct, right? And so queerness meaning that which is outside of category, is something that needs to be discussed, whether that's masculine and feminine, whether that's gay and religious. You know, a lot of people will experience that if they're like biracial, like you have 2 different tensions, you know what I mean, coming into play. And so I think a lot more of life is queer than people give credit to. What that means is that a lot of people feel dissonance in their daily life because they're forced into a box, whether it's race, whether it's political leanings, whether it's gender, whether it's spirituality. Like, people are forced into a box when by nature, I would argue that nature and life is queer, and humans make up the boxes. And if humans can make them, and if societies can make them, then we can unmake them. And I think a lot of people's lives would change if they didn't feel like they had to fit into an arbitrary box, you know? There are over 22,000 species of queer animals in the world. I can provide you with a reference for that if you would like. But there are over 22,000 queer, you know, species in the world. So queerness is innate in nature, and it's not in any way opposed to like the world. Queerness is not opposed to, or the world is not opposed to queerness. So I think that theory of queerness extends to like basically every area of my life. When it comes down to it though, being a queer person in a binary world creates a certain amount of tension because like, I'm literally just out of category. Like, I'm out of category in every way possible. I've honestly pitched myself to like Netflix and MTV as like this great person who would be really good on a TV show because like you can't pin me down. I actually made it to the final round of casting for The Circle, if you guys ever watched The Circle. And I literally pitched them on my queerness. So I literally had a phone call and like casting call with Netflix because I think the world needs to realize that the world is more queer, and the only reason you don't see it is if you're not looking for it. So I'm trying to share my story so as to create a more open world. For me, that's caused a lot of like conflict and a lot of tension. But I feel like if I can take that conflict and tension on, maybe someone in the future who's queer or trans won't have to take that on, especially if they don't feel as comfortable with themselves yet. So when that comes to, what's the title of this class again? That's what I thought. I just want to make sure. So another reason that Sonia has had me come is I've been both a social worker and a recipient of social work services. So queerness, my experience with queerness has definitely impacted how I view both the distribution of social work services and the reception of social work services. Take, for instance, I worked at the YWCA in Bradford, and our intake forms had a gender box, and it was male, female, or other. And people would always laugh and be like, oh, what's the other? And then I had to explain to them, like, there is another world. There is another world beyond this male-female binary. And so as a social worker, I saw in some ways the system was kind of designed to miss some of the most vulnerable people in the world because transgender youth are like 3 or 4 times more likely to die by suicide than their cisgender peers. And transgender adults, particularly trans women and particularly Black trans women, are much more likely, I can't remember the number, but it's a staggering amount, something above 50% more likely to live in poverty and to experience violence because of their gender, race, or orientation. Perceived gender, race, or orientation. So in a certain way, I saw from behind the desk that social work structures missed a lot of the most vulnerable people. And if you're receiving federal funds, that's of particular concern because it's sort of a federal funding clause that you have to serve everyone, you know? And then as a recipient of social services, I've seen even more. I've had doctors look me in the face and say, "What are you?" Like, what are you? And at first I said social worker because I was a social worker at the time. The doctor was like, what are you? And I was like, social worker, because I thought that they were like maybe thinking that the fact that I had back pain was like connected to my career. You know what I mean? No, they wanted to know what my genitals were. And they had no clue apparently how to ask that. They just really wanted to know if I could be pregnant, which like, is there any possibility of pregnancy? Seems less invasive than what are you? But there's a lot of ways in which a binary system can miss the most vulnerable of us, right? In medical intake forms, quite frequently, there is no box for trans. There's just male or female. And so I've been making my own box in a lot of ways for about 12 years now, because I refuse to check male or female because I am non-binary, and that has ramifications upon the services that I need because I am vulnerable to job insecurity. I am vulnerable to, threats of like economic inequity. I'm vulnerable to, if you really want to get down to it, firing, being refused for housing, being refused healthcare, all of those things I'm vulnerable because I am non-binary. And so if I am receiving a social work service, my social worker needs to know that because it's their job to help me navigate the world. So I think in a lot of ways, the social work system, as with the medical system, it's a really important conversation to have to discuss queerness and topics around it, because otherwise really there is massive amounts of the population that aren't captured. I'll give you another example. I'm currently a member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Board for the Olean City School District. We had a local pastor recently who was simultaneously the middle school principal, and he decided to deliver a sermon that said LGBTQ people, Muslims, people who receive food stamps, and people who take mental health medicine are all evil and possessed by the devil. And what's shocking is this isn't the first time something like this has happened. 3 years ago, our director of special education said that LGBTQ people were of the devil. And so as a part of like my decidedly queer political stance, whatever, or just as a person with a conscience, I said, this is not okay and not acceptable. So now we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion board. One of the things that white college educated people like to do is give surveys, but surveys kind of fall off sometimes. You know what I mean? Like surveys are not necessarily practical because they don't necessarily reach the people whose data needs to be captured the most. And for example, when I was a part of a diversity and equity committee in the school board at one point before, they wanted to do a survey. And the first question of the survey is, are you male or female? And that has an obvious flaw from the jump, is that you're not going to capture the issues and undercurrents that affect queer students or trans students if you ask, are you male or female? So in that case, you're not going to get the data you need. And of more concern around that is if you're an administrator in a social work organization, there's this saying in social work that data drives funding. And so if you don't have the data, you're not going to get the funding. And if you don't have the funding, you can't help the people. So you've got to start with good data collection methods. And if you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to get the answers you need. To use a non-queer example, or at least not queer in terms of gender and orientation, when I worked for the YWCA, we did a housing survey through HUD, which is the national agency for housing like funding in the United States. And in order for us to get HUD money to run our homeless shelter, we had to go out one day a year at a specific time. Everybody across the United States that receives HUD funding had to do this. You have to go out and you have to take a tally of the people that you see that are homeless. Well, the problem is when you live in an environment of urban poverty, you see people on the sidewalks, you see people under underpasses, you see people that are experiencing homelessness, you see them. In our area, in this area, you don't see people under a bridge because they're living in a hunting cabin that doesn't have proper utilities, or because they're staying on someone's couch, but really they don't actually live there. They're just dealing with housing instability. So you see in this situation where if you're not asking the right questions, you don't get the funding and then you can't deliver the services. I would argue that that's further proof that the world is queer because there are categories that you can't capture when you just look at either or. So I won't go all queer theory 101 on you, but I think that bears a lot of conversation, especially in terms of like just existence, but definitely social work, reception, and delivery. You have to make sure that you're asking the questions that show that you need money to help people who need services, right? This is the way it functions. And so I've experienced this. There are other intersections which are really important to consider. If you are a Black trans person, you're more likely to struggle. You're more likely to be a target of violence. If you're a Black trans woman, you're more likely to struggle. You're more likely to be a target of violence. Forget it. If you're disabled, Black and trans, you're screwed. You know what I mean? Because a lot of areas still aren't even having a conversation around ableism. Forget it. If you grew up in poverty, you're going to struggle with a classist society, because you won't necessarily know the social codes to be able to advance up that sort of classism realm. So there are all of these different areas that you have to look at. And I think, once again, that's my argument, that the world is far more queer than anyone wants to admit. And queer is far more than me having a beard, wearing dangly earrings, and speaking in an effeminate manner, you know. But I didn't realize any of this until I came out, because I came from a position of very great privilege, you know, respectively speaking. My family was really, really poor, but we were white. And my dad was in college, you know, so there was points of privilege and points of marginalization in my life. And I admit to both of those freely, but they all made me who I am and brought me to this place, if that makes sense. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell. I can answer these questions. I can answer questions that you folks may have also. It's up to you. What do you, were you going to say something, Sonia, or are you just listening?
Well, you know what, I was going to say, will you talk a little bit about the process of getting things changed?
Yes. We say this to me every year, so this has to be like maybe our 6th year doing this, at least, I think. So you always remind me of that. So transitioning in a world that is binary is it's a cog in the system, because the system is set up for either or. It's not my fault. I'm not wrong. Society is wrong. But society is a slower moving ship than my life is. You know what I mean? So I run up in these areas where it's really a struggle for me to exist on a daily basis, not the least of which being the fact that there's no box for me to check. You know what I mean? Also, my wife is on here, and she says she's my stalker. Cool. One of the things is there's no box for me to check. There's no non-binary box. There's no MX. MX is like the sort of salutation, as opposed to MS, MRS, or MR. MX is one of the more common used salutations for a non-binary person. So if there's not a non-binary box on any form I'm filling out, I am either Dr. Leo Walters Tahara or Reverend Leo Walters Tahara, alternatingly, depending on what level of sass I have on that day. So to the state of New York, for a long time, I've been Dr. Reverend Leo Walters Tahara. But that's just an example of one of the things that trans people run up on against, especially if you're non-binary. There is no box for you on government forms, and that can make things very difficult. Another area that you run into is sort of like Sonia said, the process of even getting to that point of asserting your gender orientation through your forms is you have to change your name legally. That's a thing you have to do, and usually that has to be the first thing that happens in order for all of these other services to follow. So for me, in order to receive what I needed to medically transition, I had to have a name change, and I had to be living as my preferred gender. I'm using quotes because that's like a horrible way to say it, but that's what my insurance requirement was. In order to obtain medical services related to my transition, I had to be living as my preferred gender in society for a year before I was allowed to seek hormones or any type of medical intervention surgically, which is a terribly risky for a trans person. I'm not going to lie to you. I just didn't go to bars for probably 5 years until my beard was really full and my voice had dropped more. And most importantly, I had gender affirming ID. There's nothing scarier than being a trans person with a full beard walking in with an ID that says you're a male. That makes you an instant target for violence, especially when alcohol is added. So my wife and I, we just didn't go out to bars. And I tell this story every time that I speak because it impacted me so much. But my wife, up until the present day, but this story takes place about a year or two ago, I went to the bathroom. And like you do when you're on the bathroom, I got on social media. That's what you do when you're going to the bathroom. It's like the 2020s. We use social media when we're in the bathroom. Everybody can say it's gross. We know we all do it. We wash our hands afterwards, whatever. But I got on and I checked my Facebook. And I came out of the bathroom and my wife was visibly shaken. And she was like, what the hell took so long in there? And I came out and when I came out, I was like, what? Why are you so worried? And she's like, I count every time you go into the bathroom, especially if I see a cisgender man walk in after you. Because she's literally so worried for my physical safety that in 2020, 2021, 2022, she's still counting when I go to the bathroom. And that's a very, very real lived reality for trans people, especially when you consider going into an environment where you already appear masculine to society, but you have an ID that's not gender confirming. For me personally, I'm dealing with this issue right now because New York State has they want $1,500 from me before I'm allowed to change my driver's license over to a masculine ID. And so luckily I have a mom who, please don't listen to this NSA. I have a mom who lives in Pennsylvania. And so I used her address to get gender affirming ID because I cannot afford a $1,500 payment to the DMV. What happened was I got a speeding ticket under my dead name. I wasn't living at my family's house at the time. We didn't really have a connection at that time. So the ticket went to my family's household and I did not get it. And so there was a ticket that I didn't know about. So I have to pay the court in that town. I have to pay their fees in that town. Then I have to pay New York State $1,500 to prove that I paid the fees in that town. Then I have to pay my license fee to get my license. So there's a massive economic barrier for me there to just get gender affirming ID. I couldn't even get gender affirming state ID with that. So, yeah. So what do you do? You know what I mean? There's no fund for that. New York State won't even let you break that payment up. You got to pay it all at once. So that's sort of exemplifies some of the things that you can come up against. Like I said, not the least of which being that you have to live for a year in your gender before you can, access services. Now, I was lucky enough to find some services in our region. I still had to drive 2 to 3 hours to get services, but I was lucky enough to find a psychiatrist who specializes in sex and sexuality. My insurance required that, and I literally had to drive 3 hours to get to her. And she squeezed me in on her lunch break because she does this work and she knows the realities of it. She literally had me come into my office. She said, medical gatekeeping is a bitch. Here's your paperwork. Tell me how you feel about it. Have a good day. You know what I mean? And we just chatted because she realizes that there are real barriers that trans people should not have to face because there are people gatekeeping them from accessing medical services that are life-saving. So it was another point of privilege that I was able to get a vehicle to go to that person or to have the ability to navigate the internet to find that person, to go to that person. A lot of levels of privilege that I have that allowed me to get there. But could you, for a second, imagine a displaced youth who was, a Black trans woman in rural America who cannot access hormone replacement surgery, or hormone replacement therapy, surgery, or even gender-affirming clothing on their own? Can you imagine the levels of struggle that they go through? It gives me chills to think about still, because for as much hardship as I have faced, as many times as our business window has been smashed with a brick, those things really don't compare to what a Black trans person goes through, to even a Black non-binary person and an Indigenous trans woman. You know what I mean? Indigenous women, for the record, are the single most vulnerable population in the United States, but it's never reported on. So we can't even say how much more vulnerable they are than Black trans women because we don't report on Indigenous people. I listened to a podcast about Indigenous women, and there was something like 3,000 or 4,000 open cases that were just not being worked on in Canada. And Canada's in a lot of ways, way more progressive than the United States, but we don't talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women. We definitely don't talk about them if they're trans. So there's a lot of privilege that I do have that I acknowledge. But these are just some of the things I've experienced in my process in terms of medical gatekeeping and in terms of not being able to access gender-affirming ID. And I'm saying these very sobering stories from a point of I still have a lot more privilege than most people do. I'm able to self-advocate. I had to fight my insurance to get proof for surgery. I had to put all these points of proof together. I had to have 3 letters from different mental health professionals. I'm not sure if you're familiar with insurance, but they don't like to give you more than one of anything. You can't just see random doctors without referral. That's the word I wanted. I wanted to say recommendation. That's not it. Without a referral. So there are all these ways in which, if you're not able to advocate for yourself because of classist barriers, because of ability barriers, because of just simply not knowing, there's so many ways in which this sort of marginalization can compound. And being trans definitely exposed me to those in a way I didn't know before in my life of relative privilege before transition. So, did that answer your question?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about, we were talking last
Yeah.
week about the cost of hormone replacement therapy and the fact that it's a disproportionate copay
Yeah.
for people who are using it for transgender purposes, quite honestly, versus if a woman goes on an estradiol or something because
Yep.
she had, say, she's gone through, yeah.
I can absolutely speak to that. When I first started medically transitioning, I was I was working at a job where I had my insurance was paid through my job. And it was when I first started. Like, I remember very clearly, I was at my job in the evening. It was after everybody else worked. I was just closing up the homeless shelter. And I went to the bathroom and I was preparing to perform in a drag performance. And I already had a little bit of facial hair before transition. And so I was like, you know what, let's be wild. I found some mascara in our like donation shelter. I was sorting through it. Let's be wild. Let's put some mascara on my facial hair. And all of a sudden I had sideburns and like a little bit of a goatee. And that was like, it was one of the moments where I was like, oh shit. You know, like now I really do got to go through with this. But I had insurance through this job. And so I researched and I figured out what I needed to do to get on HRT. One of the things I needed to do once I found a provider who's 2.5 hours away, I had to get a blood test to test my testosterone levels. I got a blood test. I looked on my explanation of benefits, which is a word that you only know if you're trans or you have a sort of like other medical condition where you have to consult your insurance. That's a thing, an explanation of benefits. And I looked and it said it covered blood testing for hormone level or for hormone levels, right? Fast forward to like 6 months to a year later, and I get a bill in the mail for $3,000. And I open it up, and I was like, well, what the hell? And it was this blood test. And fast forward another week, I get another one. I had 3 of these letters, like $3,000 each time for a blood test that, get this, it would have been covered if my gender marker was M. But because my gender marker was F, I was on the hook for this blood test. So over my cold, dead trans body will Quest Diagnostics, take that to the bank, Quest. Over my cold, dead trans body will Quest Diagnostic get that money from me because my insurance simply didn't pay because my gender marker was F. And that's just one of the sort of examples of the ways in which things are not covered for trans people. Some, even when transgender like surgeries are approved, which for the record, just let me state this, you don't have to have any surgery or take any hormone to be valid as a trans person. Just throwing that out there. But for those who do want to medically transition, there's a lot of hurdles that exist. Some surgeries that are covered, like a double mastectomy, which is what I had. It was commonly referred to as top surgery. It would be covered if I had breast cancer. It under my old insurance plan, it would not have been covered, even though it was deemed medically necessary by a psychiatrist and a psychologist and multiple doctors and a chiropractor. It would not have been covered because it was for trans reasons. Luckily, that's one of the things that made me move to New York State. There's some things about New York State I really don't like, but they do have a law saying that Medicare and Medicaid state-funded insurance has to cover medical services for trans-related costs. But then even then, there's a whole issue of finding someone to treat you because you might have to pay out of pocket because they're not your in-network primary care physician. Some of the costs, like Sonia was saying, in terms of medicine or even prescription of medicine, trans people or cisgender people can get these medicines prescribed to them and have them covered by their insurance. But trans people cannot get them covered by their insurance because they are trans. So they might even pay into this insurance and still not be covered, right? For me, I'm lucky because I happen to have Fidelis, and they cover my hormones. But I mean, I pay $1 a month. But also now, because my provider is not local, my hormone prescription constantly gets interrupted, and so my levels fluctuate, which throws your whole body into a tailspin. But my PCP here will not prescribe testosterone, even though the prescribing schedule for trans male hormone replacement therapy is the exact same schedule that cisgender men take when they're losing their hair or they just feel a little tired. If men have low testosterone levels, it's the same prescription scale in terms of how they dose it. It's the same prescription scale that I would take. And a PCP, your primary care physician, is allowed to prescribe hormones, but mine here will not. And so, like, I might have to pay for my visit to go see another primary care physician to get that, you know? So there are ways in which the costs are just not equitable, and the only reason is because I am trans. Like, that's what it boils down to, you know what I mean? And if you can't get a prescription for testosterone, or if you can only like pay for, say, like the blood work, but you don't have prescription drug coverage, you can be $300, $400, $500 a month before you even blink when looking to get testosterone. The same testosterone that a cisgender male could get for like $1 a month. You know, it's just a really inequitable distribution of resources. So there's a lot of those. There's a lot of those things that come into play. And I use the term medical gatekeeping, which I'd like to explain. Medical gatekeeping is not exclusive to the queer community. I was talking today to a friend who doesn't want to have children, so she'd like to have her tubes tied so that she doesn't have to go on hormonal birth control. The doctor said they won't even consider it until she's had multiple children and she's of a certain age. And so that's another example in which a person doesn't have control of their own body because of medical gatekeeping. Does that help it make sense a little bit? Medical gatekeeping is not exclusive to the trans community, but it is very, very prevalent in the trans community. So, and even the idea of requiring a psychiatrist or multiple psychologists to write letters to affirm your identity is dehumanizing, and it's medical gatekeeping, because like you can't just access anyone here. Closest place is Buffalo, really, where someone specializes in it. And then there's like a Center for Sex and Sexuality, I think. And when I called them, there was a 12-month waiting list just to get my initial intake. And and I wasn't going to get my hormones for a while, so there's so many factors of medical gatekeeping that like occur in our world. Actually, Planned Parenthood is one of the best resources right now for trans people, because typically you can access PCP care through Planned Parenthood, especially, and it's income based. So that's really important. And you can access your care there and visit a doctor there. And a lot of times they'll take insurance, or they'll work on a sliding fee scale. So there's just like a lot to consider in terms of ways that trans people, non-binary people, and gay people fall through the cracks. I mean, for instance, there's a medication called PrEP that's out there right now. And if you take it daily, it reduces your chance of contracting HIV to almost none. But it's not, very few people know about it. You probably have to go to Buffalo to get it prescribed. It's not pushed out there. And this is certainly nothing new. If you look at the AIDS epidemic from like the 60s, 70s, 80s, if you talk to any gay man who lived through that area, the absolute horrors that they went through of watching their friends and their family just wither away in front of their eyes, while evangelical preachers like Billy Graham literally were publicly and nationally preaching that AIDS was gay cancer and it was God's punishment on the homosexual population. These things happen all the time. It's medical gatekeeping is not new, and the way people treat queer people is not new. I reference that because there's still massive inequities in the way that people deal with AIDS and HIV treatment in the world, and there is answers and there are treatments, but it's still so stigmatized. So that's a really big issue, especially if you're a social worker in a medical office. That would definitely be something that you would see firsthand. You know what I mean? So, do you have any other questions?
Well, I'm going to turn the lights on.
Okay.
It'll be dark in here at some point.
All right.
So just to let you know about PrEP, PrEP is what's called a specialty medication. So if you go to your pharmacy and you have a prescription for it, you probably can't pick it up today.
Mm-hmm.
They have to order it in for you, which really we should be, it should be much more prevalent.
Absolutely.
And typically in terms of when we look at hormonal replacement therapy, that you have to go see an endocrinologist.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, I mean, we don't have any specialty in our area. Jamestown, actually, Evergreen Health Services.
Yes, Evergreen is actually opening up an only-on clinic. I just found this out the other day because I couldn't get my testosterone. my pharmacy said, you didn't get the prescription. So I called my office and they're like, well, we're cutting you off because we haven't seen you in person in 2 years. I said, that's bullshit. You saw me via telehealth during the pandemic, whatever. I talked to them. They were very nice. But then they let me know that there's going to be a one day a month, Evergreen is going to do a clinic here in Olean. So there are services coming, but you can kind of see the gap there, like you were saying, or even picking up prescriptions, like.
Yeah. And the Center for Sexuality, it has, they're psychologists retired.
Okay.
But they're clinicians and kind of they're the first step, right? You
Okay.
have to go there and get the seal of approval
Yep.
that basically says, okay, you have gender dysphoria.
Yep.
Actually, do you want to talk a little bit about gender dysphoria?
I do. So gender dysphoria is, oh my, I have all the thoughts about medical classification. I'm literally, this is I'm taking a queer religiosities class this semester, so I'm talking about queer theory, religious theory, and how they all interact in the social realm. It's a fascinating class. But we're talking about the pathologizing of queer identity. And what that means is if you look back at the it's Diagnostical Statistics Manual, it's the DSM. I can never remember the initials, but the DSM is the book that basically classifies mental health issues, right? And up until I think it was 4, transsexualism and homosexuality were listed as mental disorders. They were essentially mental defects that were categorizable by medical professionals, counselors, whatever. Now, fast forward to today, and those have been removed from the DSM, which is really important to let people know, but gender dysphoria still exists. And gender dysphoria is kind of a box you have to check to get any health care, which is not okay, and I'll give you an example why. Gender dysphoria is this idea that you were basically born in the wrong body. Gender dysphoria is the medical classification for it. But for me, as a non-binary person, I was not born in the wrong body. I was born in the exact right body. It just needed some modifications. Do you color your hair? Do you have glasses? Okay, I needed top surgery to be my best self, right? But in requiring that, a lot of insurances and doctors make you be diagnosed with a mental health condition called gender dysphoria to access treatment that allows you to live your identity. So in another way, you see where there's a barrier set up by this artificial category of DSM, in the DSM considered gender dysphoria. I don't have gender dysphoria. I know exactly what my gender is. You're the one that doesn't know what it is. Why do I have to fit into your book to get my services? I'm coming up to the pharmacist please, can I have some more? It's just crazy because no one else should be able to have that amount of sway in someone else's life. My identity is valid because I exist. You can look me in the eyes and say you're not non-binary because our book doesn't have a category for that. And I'm going to be I'm right here, And I feel that's what this gender dysphoria is, because for a lot of people with top surgery, you have to have a letter certifying that you say you have gender dysphoria. So you are required to obtain a mental health diagnosis to access medical care. How crazy is that? You're required to have a diagnosable mental illness before you're allowed to get medical care. It's crazy to me. Crazy.
And that goes with, actually, you have to have that diagnosis, and then you have to be living.
Yes.
For 1 year.
Yep.
In your preferred gender.
Yep, in your preferred gender.
Before you can then truly access.
Yep, yeah, so it goes diagnosis of mental health issue, live for a year in a vulnerable state. Imagine being a pre-op, pre-HRT trans woman in Olean. I would actually rather just crawl under a rock, to be honest. And so you have this diagnosis of mental illness, then a year of living in a vulnerable state. Then you can begin the process of being approved for hormones. And hormones don't really start to take effect right away. I mean, they do, but I mean, I didn't pass, which I hate the term, but society didn't believe I was a male really until 3 to 4 years on HRT. So now if you look at the timetable, it's even further, right? You have diagnosis of mental health issue. year of living in a vulnerable situation, which you can be fired from your job or kicked out from your apartment or subject to violence and the police won't report it as a hate crime. That has happened to me here in this town. All of those things can happen when you're in that vulnerable state. Then you can begin to ask for HRT. Please, sir, can I have some hormones, sir? And then you have to wait for the hormones to take effect. So we're looking at half a decade or more for people. You know what I mean? That's just utter insanity. And not only are people who are queer already vulnerable, you're actually, the binary is manufacturing the danger. The binary is manufacturing the inequity. Like the inequity and danger they don't just naturally occur. Like if I was just a queer person out in the wilderness, I stand as much chance as anybody else at surviving. It's the man-made world that created the danger for me. It's the man-made decisions and structures that created the inequity for me. Like a deer is not going to look at me and be like, you're queer. I'm not going to feed you if you kill me. You know what I mean? It's a man-made structures and man-made ideas and human-made systems that create the hate and the inequity and the disadvantage and the danger. Does that make sense? Cool. Sorry, I was having a moment there. I was having a moment, but it's just so I can't unsee these things. Like I could never go back to the life of relative privilege I had before coming out, because I can't unknow this, you know. So. Do you folks have questions for me? I have these questions from before, which were like really great, but I'd just love to offer you the opportunity to ask if you want. Also, I'd like to pre-disclose or make this statement before any questions. This is a safe space, and I'm deciding to set it apart for you to ask me these questions. I'm going to withhold any amount of judgment from you, because this is your chance to ask a question and get the wording wrong. I'm going to assume good intentions from you, and that we're here in this space to learn. That is not always true in the outside world, and so no trans or queer person owes you an answer to a question in the outside world, because that's your job to know. But in this space, I'm telling you it's my intention to create space for you to mess up words, for you to mess up questions, for you to have to say things 3 different ways. That's okay right now. No trans person owes you an answer, just as no black person owes you an answer about racism. But I'm telling you, in this space, I'm giving you the permission to ask me what you need to. And if I feel like it's an uncomfortable question, I'll explain to you why, and then I'll either answer it or not, okay? Does that sound fair? All right. Did you have a question?
Yeah, you said it takes, like, for some people, like, almost like half a decade or more.
Yeah.
Since COVID's been going on for about, like, 3 years, do you think that had a really big impact on, like, people's process to transition?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think COVID definitely impacted people's process of transition. Like I said, not the least of which being just getting to appointments, but even I feel like what happened during COVID was all like non-essential stuff was canceled. So a top surgery is going to be considered non-essential. But it literally could be the difference between a trans man or non-binary person like living or unaliving themselves, right? So I think that there's a lot of ways in which COVID disrupted service distribution. And you see that from people who were already like vulnerable economically, having a hard time making ends meet. People who were not vulnerable economically had trouble accessing services and getting their needs met and everything because of COVID. And when you look at the effects of COVID on your control population, which is the like majority, if you start to look at marginalized populations outside of that, you'll see that Black, brown, and indigenous people had higher rates of COVID and received less resources, basically. There's all sorts of reasons for that, societal structures and all, but I think COVID absolutely exacerbated that sort of like extended time period for people accessing gender affirming care and services. Definitely. I think there's not a ton it didn't affect, honestly, but the problem is when you hit a rough patch, like when I hit a rough patch, I have a successful business. I am in graduate school and I live paycheck to paycheck. I don't even own my cell phone because I have so much student loan debt. Sorry for you. But like, I don't even own my cell phone, but I'm fairly privileged in society. And COVID threw me through a loop, man. Like, I'm telling you, like, shut off notices, like trying to hold on to utilities, trying to hold on to cell phone, trying to, buy groceries. And I have relative privilege. So when you look at the impact of a global pandemic or, like adverse event, if it's rough for the control population, it's how ripples like dissipate as they go out further? It's kind of opposite. It gets more intense as that event hits marginalized populations, which is really necessary to consider in social work because you're dealing with marginalized populations, right? So, did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make sure, I like talk a lot, so I want to make sure I really answer the question. Does anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
How do you feel like your situation could have been, like, how do you feel like it could have been different if you were not white? You know what I mean?
Oh God, yeah. I think race is an inextricable part of anyone's experience in the world. And the second that you read as not Caucasian, your experience in the world becomes exponentially more difficult. Like, if you'll notice that at this point, like, even in racial discourse in America, people are still only talking about black and white. If you're mixed, screw you. Like, you don't exist, your problems don't exist, you know what I mean? And so I think in general, there's a lot that goes on, from what I understand behind the scenes about like black people accessing healthcare. There's like a lot lower of a chance that a black person is going to access and receive the healthcare that they need. Some of those are service problems. Some of those are racial bias. And then some of those also are cultural attitudes of like, black folks, like, you experimented on us for a really long time, so we're not going to come to you. And so I think the second that you're not Caucasian, the system wasn't designed to work for you. I have a good friend who's a veterinarian, random, as I go on with this story, but she was reading a book, and I can't remember what it's called. I'm going to be so mad about this. But it was about the experience of being like a woman in America. And what started this book was a scientific study about why more women were dying in car accidents. And it turns out that the crash test dummies were modeled after a Caucasian, 6-foot-tall male. So then right off the bat, if you're not Caucasian, 6-foot-tall or male, anatomically, you're at a disadvantage. And so then people started to blow that out further and look at different areas. And then we find things like, all the way to the extreme of doctors not believing that black women need pain medicine because they're not as susceptible to pain. There's all of these things that happen when you throw race into the mix because our Caucasian-centric world or Eurocentric world is only geared at looking at one type of person. And if you're not that person, well, like, sorry for your luck, And then throw in that not only if you're like of a different race or biracial, but if you're not an English as a first language speaker, forget accessing services here. Like, they'll have a telephone that you can hold up and it's supposed to translate between you and your healthcare worker, It's just, I'm not saying that people around here don't try, because I know there are good social workers here, but there's a gap in service provision. And when you look at marginalized populations, that gets even greater. I don't know if you folks have heard of the term of intersectionality. By a raise of hands, have any of you guys heard of that term? Okay, so intersectionality is an idea that was first put forth by the scholarly Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a black woman. And there's an amazing TED Talk she gives. If you Google Kimberly Crenshaw TED Talk, the most popular one here is where she kind of explains intersectionality. But she gives like 5 names. She says, do you know the name Eric Gardner? Do you know the name Mike Brown? Do you know the name Trayvon Martin? Do you know the name of George Floyd? No, it was before George Floyd. And pretty much everybody raised their hands. And then she said, do you know Michelle Cusseau? No one raised their hands. And she listed 4 or 5 other women, and they were black women that were victims of police violence. And she uses that to illustrate the idea of intersectionality, which is that people have different facets of their life. And if you are disadvantaged in one facet and you are disadvantaged in in another facet, those two actually interact. And she talked about, another example she gives is like workplace like discrimination, essentially. And she found out that women were experiencing workplace discrimination and black people were experiencing workplace discrimination, but they didn't actually study black women. And so what happens is when you add these areas together, you get an exponential amount of marginalization. And that, I think, is what happens when you look at an idea of like a black or brown or indigenous trans person. they're coming up against on multiple intersections. And I think that it's absolutely intellectually dishonest for people to say that race does not affect a person's life in this day and age. There is so much science to prove that. And if you don't believe that race affects a person's experience in this world, we are past the point of grace. You are actually just a racist. I don't have any more time for the conversation than that, If you don't believe life is different for a black man, then try being a black man and having a cop stop you, right? If you don't understand that race plays a role in a person's experience in the world at this point in history, you are actually just a racist. I think the race is a fake category, just as borders are fake. Like if you go to the border between America and Mexico, like there's not an actual wall that exists. You don't just like run into a force field and then stop. Borders were not real. They're not tangible. And race was not a thing. It was created. It was created to be like a binary and divide people and categorize people. And race as a category, it creates just as many, if not more, disadvantages than gender and orientation. So that's my diatribe about race. Sorry. Did that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
So when you said you have 5 kids, right?
Yes.
So when are they adopted or was it harder for you to be able to have kids of your own because of everything, because if people view you as mentally ill,
right? Yeah, no, I see where you're going with that. And I think that your question hits on a couple areas, right? So first of all is reproductive healthcare and reproductive rights for a person who is deemed as, mentally disabled or categorized in some way, right? And then you have the area of parenting kid. My kids are not biologically mine, but they are mine. Trust me, my bank account will tell you that they're mine, but also it hits on that sort of idea of adopted and step parenting. And then also it hits on the idea of race again, because race is inextricable from our conversation, but my children are black and brown. And when I go to the store, they won't I was trying to make beer cheese dip, which requires 1 pounder. And I took my kids there, and at Walmart, they're like, you can't buy beer unless all your friends have their ID. And I was like, these guys, they're like my children. They were 12, 13, 14 at the time. Very distinctly not like my posse. I'm not just picking up 14-year-olds off the street to buy them 1 beer, And they wouldn't sell me the beer. And then that happened again. And I was there with my wife, but she's in another aisle. And I was like, babe, do you have your ID? And at that point I had my ID and I had the same last name as my kids. And Elle goes, is it because they're black and he's white? Because that is my kid's father. And my kids just scattered like cockroaches because they didn't want to be around. But I think that what you're talking about there is there's intersections of sort of that affect my ability to be a parent in the world, So reproductively, I didn't have concerns in terms of wanting to have kids because I didn't feel like I wanted to have kids. But it's a major concern because you can look at the cultural discourse around birthing persons or mothers, women everywhere upset that they're like, boys can't have babies. And I was like, motherfucker, I have a uterus. I could use it if I wanted to, But you begin to experience transphobia, medical gatekeeping, all of these things the second you're outside the norm and you try to access reproductive health care. For me to get a hysterectomy, which I've tried, you do not imagine the amount of people that have to physically examine me and sign up on my mental health to be able to get a hysterectomy, And then you come up on the idea of I've been discriminated against by one of our kids' fathers who actually was physically violent with me. And then the police took his side and arrested me for being assaulted by him because I was trans. And he did not like my engagement with his son. He tried to go to a psychiatrist and prove that it was damaging for me to take my testosterone in front of my son. And to which the counselor said, oh, by the way, it's the same as diabetes. Sorry for your luck. But so there's been ways in which I was marginalized by another parent, basically, and then the race card. People just can't understand that these are my kids, So I think it creates sort of a trifecta of I won't even say disadvantage, but it is the triple intersection of ways that make it kind of difficult for me to be a parent in this world, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's been really interesting to say the least. So did that answer your question? Okay. I know it's a little bit more, but I really think that all of those intersections become important in the conversation.
So I was gonna say, in adding, because we are in a binary world, so
Yep.
usually what we see is MTF, FTM.
Exactly.
But even when we use that language. So
Yep.
in talking about that, though, and you and I've talked some about, there's a difference.
Oh yeah.
When we have individuals who are identifying as male and transitioning versus female,
Mhm.
and how that goes along, to include things about not just identification of sex and gender, but ability to have.
Oh, absolutely.
Is significantly different.
Absolutely.
With somebody who identifies as female and
Yes.
is taken, so no longer has testosterone.
Yep.
Is taken estradiol.
Yeah.
And then things don't work.
Yeah, there is a very, man, I will go on record as saying that I believe it's much harder to be a person who is assigned male at birth. Instead of saying, like, I don't say that I was born a female. I express my experience of the world as I was assigned female at birth because I didn't choose to be categorized as a female. The world chose that I was female because they looked between my legs. And if you want to know more about that, please look up the history of intersex people in the world, because intersex people exist and oftentimes they are subject to medical procedures that are not medically necessary so that aesthetically their genitals will fit a certain category. That's a side note. But I was assigned female at birth, and I personally believe it is much harder to be assigned female at birth, or it's much harder to be assigned male at birth and transition to female, as opposed to being assigned female at birth and transitioning to male. The secondary sex characteristics that testosterone produce are way, way, way harder to hide or to mitigate, such as jaw lines, just physical anatomy, voice changes. Those things are much harder to deal with than it is to throw testosterone at estrogen-driven traits. I can become more muscular and my voice can become lower, but a trans woman's voice will never become lower without medical intervention. So I think it's much harder to be a trans female. I also think that's because of our gender binary, because our world is structured to believe that being male is the ultimate, just like we're supposed to believe that being white is the ultimate. We've set that as our goal, as our beauty goal, as our normative stance in society towards advertising. Like, you're supposed to want to be white, you're supposed to want to be able-bodied, you're supposed to want to be cisgendered, all these things. And so our world sees masculine as the ultimate. So if you're a trans male, trans female, not only is it harder to work with the secondary sex characteristics of testosterone, you're also transgressing the entire system. You're saying, I'm giving up the ultimate for that which is considered inferior. I mean, for a while, there wasn't actually two genders. There was just males and defective males. Like, that's actually in sort of the history of how gender developed, is that people were considered defective males instead of females. Like, can we take a second and think about how awful that is? Like, you're not actually a girl, you're just a defective male. Just like something got messed up along the way and now you're a female. And our society is kind of developed off that notion. So I think it's in a lot of ways harder for trans females. And then you have the effects of medicine on your body also when it comes to reproduction as a trans person. So testosterone affects your eggs and in their function in your body, and estrogen affects the ability of the male, anatomically or biologically masculine body. So you have all sorts of consideration when it comes to how you're going to have children. Are you going to try to have children without medical intervention? Are you going to try to have children with medical intervention? Are you going to be told you can't adopt because you're gay? All of these, there's so many things that come into play with that. Did that help? Does anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, how do you feel about, trans representation in TV shows and media and all that?
Yeah, okay, so that's a pretty cool thing. I think, actually, you can really kind of trace transgender conversation has happened for a long time. I mean, one of the most popular like one of the most original sort of presentations of a trans person in the media was the film Boys Don't Cry with Hilary Swank, which is a horrifying movie. I watched it and then I wept in the bathroom alone for like 3 hours, and I was like, I'm gonna die. This is before I ever knew I was trans. I should have rung some alarm bells, right? But there's been trans people in the media, but what you see, or what you would traditionally see as trans men being the subject of like rape by cisgendered men, or trans women being a dead sex worker on a crime show. Those were sort of the tropes that you would see. But up until recently, you didn't see that narrative change. It was just those tropes. But then, in Time magazine, I wish I could remember the date on it, but Laverne Cox was featured on the cover of Time magazine, and the title of the article was The Transgender Tipping Point. And she really hit a lot of important things. Like Laverne Cox has done a lot for trans women, and she'll be the first to admit that she has a lot of privilege that she works with, but I do think that she's attempting to use that privilege, levy that privilege to help the world in general. But from that article forward, there has been a distinct increase in social conversation around trans people, around trans representations, and around trans rights. We are nowhere where we need to be, but I do think that we are getting to a better place. The fact that we have trans actors playing trans characters, or we have trans actors playing cisgender characters, people aren't so pigeonholed as they were. There is absolutely still discrimination, and it's absolutely still inequitable, but I really do think that we are especially around the time of that article, we've hit a tipping point. So we're not at an ultimate yet, but we are definitely kind of, does anyone work out or do cardio? I freaking hate cardio. I was a college athlete. I hated cardio the whole time. But when you're doing like an endurance workout or something, once you get past that halfway mark, you're like, oh my God, we're almost done. 10 more minutes, 5 more minutes, 1 more minute, and it's like you pass this sort of physical threshold where everything else is downhill. I think that's what we're seeing, and I hope to see more of, right? As we've passed a physical threshold where at least we're a part of the conversation now, maybe then things can get better, and that's hints back to the idea of, how when the Black Lives Matter movement uses the cry of like, say her name or say his name, right? People argue like, well, why do we got to do that? Or why do we have to say Black Lives Matter? Because in some ways, language and visibility have to happen before we're ever going to have progress. Because if I don't exist, then you don't have to care about my rights. And that's why it's important that we talk about areas of marginalization, transgender people, missing and murdered Indigenous women, all of these people, sex workers as opposed to, prostitutes. All of these things give people their personhood. And once a person or people group has personhood, then they have rights. But if there's no language to discuss us, then we obviously don't exist and we don't have rights. And that's why I think it's really important. And that's why I think the cry of say her name or say his name really, really matters, is because it puts firmly into the cultural mindset that this person existed. And then you have to deal with what happened to them. So I think it's a lot of the same way with trans people. Once we exist, especially in media, because media is a really great vehicle. Once we exist in media, then the world has to respond to our existence, because before they just pretended we didn't exist. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
I know it's kind of like broad, but I think in my mind, really all this stuff really is connected. So I see your hand. There is a movie on Netflix, and I can't remember the name of it, but Laverne Cox is in it, and she talks about Black trans representation in media, and she has Black trans women on there that were active and visible in media all the way back to like the 60s, 50s, and some of them were not even out until like the 2000s. And I can't remember what the name of it is.
Is it called Disclosure?
Yes, Disclosure. Yes, it's so good because it really just gives those people their personhood that they may or may not have had during their career. And I can only imagine how relieving that is to come out after you've had a career and be like, I am here. You know what I mean? You see that recently with like Nikki tutorials. I don't know if any of you guys watch makeup tutorials, but I'm in the beauty industry, so I see these things. And Nikki tutorials was actually outed by somebody, but Yeah.
I feel like this stuff is more talked about now and like within the last couple of years than it was ever before.
Yeah.
Like, I have younger siblings and they're learning about it in schools, but I never did
Mhm.
until college.
Mhm.
So do you think that like how much more prevalent it is in society and like talked about? Do you think that socially it's made things better for people like in the like LGBT community or like worse? Because I know there's also a lot of people that have like old-fashioned views that speak out.
Yeah. So your question is essentially summed up with like, is this visibility positive or negative, right? I think that it's positive. I'm saying that from a point of privilege, though. Like I have been a victim of hate crimes because of my public display of my orientation, like whatever that means, the back end of that story is that during the George Floyd protests, we put a sign on our window that says the first Pride was a riot against police brutality, #Happy Pride, #Black Lives Matter. Someone threw a window through that sign, literally on the sign, and the police said there wasn't enough evidence to consider it a hate crime. So that's an example where visibility was like not necessarily the most positive, but I think my privilege is something that I can levy to use my vulnerability or to use my visibility, right? So I have a certain amount of privilege that secures me in life. And so I feel like it's my moral mandate to use my privilege to be visible because I have this safety net. It might not be like a lot, but I have a house, I have a family, I have a loving partner, and all these things are my safety net. And so I think it's my job to levy that privilege to be visible. Because some people don't have the ability to be visible or would be subject to violence to be out. So it's a double-edged sword, but I would hope that people that have the privilege to stabilize themselves, or the privilege that allows them to stabilize themselves, would use that voice to speak, because there's always someone else that can't speak. There's people who can't come out because it's too much of a risk for them. In the 70s, Harvey Milk, who was like the first elected queer official in the United States, his campaign speech was come out wherever you are. And there's a scene in the movie Milk where he's in the room with his campaign team and he looks at him, he's like, "Are you out?" And the person's like, "No." And he hands him the phone and he's like, "Call your parents right now. We have to be visible." But that is not always the best thing, because at this point in life, it might not be safe for everybody to come out. And so you can't force people out of the closet if they're not safe. And I feel like that's where visibility is a give and take. And I would hope that people with privilege would levy their privilege to be visible for those who can't be visible. Does that make sense? This is sort of a both and. It's a calculated risk, but it's a risk I can sustain. So, yeah. Does anybody else have questions? Yeah.
So, I took last semester a health analytics class, and basically what we tackled was a lot of like injustices within the healthcare system all over the place. It's
Yeah.
just awful.
It is. It really, really is.
And at one point, we started talking about trans youths and when should they be able to transition. Because right now, we're in such like a time where it's easier for kids to express themselves with gender, but sometimes like you're looking at statistics where they get to a point where they get to transition fully medically, and then they find out that they wanted to detransition and that was just expression. So what do you think could be done to handle that?
So, yeah, that's a really interesting question, because everybody wants to protect the children. That's what they say. Really, what they want to do is protect normativity, right? I think that children should have access to gender-affirming and healthcare and mental health care that fits where they're at in life. I think when it comes to children, people have made a lot to do about nothing, because there is an avenue that you can take in terms of medically, interacting with your gender in terms of hormone blockers. Hormone blockers, I'm not a doctor. I don't have a license to treat or diagnose, but I'm telling you what I know because I've had to learn these things, right? Hormone blockers are a medicine that literally just halts hormone like production and onset of puberty. So I actually think that children should be absolutely able to access gender-affirming healthcare, because if I had a child who was assigned male at birth, they come to understand themselves to be female or non-binary, it is going to be so much infinitely easier for my child if they don't have testosterone-driven puberty. They're not going to develop an Adam's apple. They're not going to get as tall. Their physical development is not gonna be the same. Their skin's going to stay softer. Like, there are so many things that hormone blockers would prevent. Like, almost no trans female surgical procedures are covered by insurance. They are all considered cosmetic. And if my child was able to access blockers, the only consequence of blockers is that if they decide they want to have a testosterone-driven puberty, you just take them off blockers. And so I absolutely think that children are old enough to know and to advocate for themselves. Absolutely. Like, how does my child know they're a man? How does my child know they're a female? Is someone else telling them? Are we letting them discover for themselves? Are those things even real? They're not. Plot twist, but it's like a whole nother lecture. But I think absolutely it is absolutely so crucial for kids who experience gender variance to be able to access blockers. They save so much trauma, so much physical pain. Like, I wouldn't want to go through the physical pain of having my jaw shaved. That sounds awful. That's like having my trachea shaved. That's having my vocal cords shortened. Those are all things that trans women find themselves needing to do sometimes to find a place of gender affirmation in their own life. And all of those can be prevented with hormone blockers.
So
Yes.
what I will say, though, is interesting when we look at medical procedures that we use hormone blockers in the medical field for other things.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a child who is not with an eating disorder who is not growing and stuff, and you don't want them. If you have a child with leukemia, that you don't want them to go through puberty first. So we use the blockers already in our society.
And we use them with kids.
When do we use
Yep.
them, and how do we use them?
Yep, exactly.
Right? Because we'll prevent puberty if you have a child going through leukemia
Yep.
at times, so that the treatment is more effective.
Absolutely.
So when we're looking at these things, we have to look at kind of why we use them here and we don't use them here.
Exactly.
I think that's the question.
Yep, exactly. And what's someone really going to say? Like, if you really push someone on that, it's like when I said at this point, if you don't admit that race plays a role, you're just a racist. If you don't admit that gender plays a role, you're just it's not even phobic. You're just hateful towards trans people.
And when you stop, puberty progresses.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing.
Exactly.
If you're taking testosterone and you stop,
Yep.
then the female secondary sex characteristics come back.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, hormone or puberty blockers are like a zero-sum loss. You know what I mean? Like, I also think the notion of transitioning and detransitioning is societally driven. Because a child might develop in a way to which their sort of gender expression changes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their body does or doesn't have to change. And so I think that the terms transition and detransition are very similar to the term passing, which passing is not a real thing. I don't have to pass. I don't have to sell my gender to anyone else. To hell with you if you don't understand my gender expression. It does not matter, Like, I am real because I exist. And so I think that a lot of times, and this will happen particularly in the intersex community, is you feel like you have to move towards one side of the binary or the other to fit in society. But it's not your body that's broken, it's society that's broken. And so that I think a lot of times transitioning and detransitioning, my friend said something when I came out that really exemplifies this, and she said, I wish you didn't have to transition. And that really hurt me for a minute, but I totally understand what she was saying. She was already thinking next level beyond me. She was thinking you shouldn't have to come out. You should just be Leo. And I totally agree with that. So that's another way in which language creates reality and reality creates language. It's like a chicken and the egg conversation. I actually had this conversation over the shampoo bowl earlier. So nice light conversation at my salon. There's two things you're not supposed to talk about as a hairdresser. One of them is politics and one of them is religion. And I just fail miserably. Do you guys have any other questions? Yeah.
So you said you were on the Olean School District for Diversity.
Yep.
So I'm also going into education. I'm openly gay and
Okay.
stuff. So how do you navigate that? Because I'm really scared that I don't know, I worked at a school where they had the kid. It was really the parents, not even the kids. They changed the staff bathroom to all to gender neutral, and the parents had a fit about it. The kids are saying how do you I always worry about my personal life has no effect on what I do.
Right, absolutely.
So how do you I'd always be scared that parents are gonna be I don't want my child being taught by this teacher because of this, and this.
Oh, yeah,
So
absolutely.
I like worry about that.
Absolutely. And that's a very real concern, both as a professional, like as a teaching professional and administrator, if you were to be in that position, because those are realities you have to deal with, especially if you're in a small town. Speaking on what we're trying to do in Olean we happen to have pretty great teachers. For us, our administration has been our administration is bad, bro. It's real bad. And actually our teachers union has been fantastic. And so, I hate to say it, but that's something you almost have to feel out when you go out there, because you just emphasize something that's a very real reality for a queer person, is that your job can be affected by this, your whole livelihood. And so that's just a perfect illustration of the ways in which gender can and does influence people's lives. For us, what we're trying to do on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee is that we are trying to create, in my mind, we need to create policies that prohibit these sort of hate-filled actions from taking place again. And so for me, I'm looking at short-term ways that the school can stop the bleeding and long-term ways that the school can heal the wound. And for us, that's got to come from our administration. I like to really champion our teachers whenever possible, because I think they've been fantastic. And I think the union, our teachers did not have a fair contract for 3 years. I think it was like 400 and some days that they didn't have a contract, and it was during COVID. They were working without a fair and equitable contract, and our school board refused to agree to settle on one. But our teachers union stood strong, and ultimately they got their contract. And in the middle of that battle, our teachers union put out a sign that said, "We care for our students, we don't condemn them." They put a full page ad in the newspaper. I was like, oh, that's a big dick move. So I think you just have to, when you're working, you have to steel yourself to the reality that could happen to you, and you have to do it anyways. And I hate to say that, because you shouldn't have to, but there is that chance that you could run up against that in the world. And for me, I've just made a decision that I'm not going to be less than myself wherever I go, and I have to find a place that can be a reality. Yeah.
So I'm gonna say what shouldn't have to happen.
Yeah.
I would say that as a new professional, that it becomes very important in the interviewing process.
Yeah.
So that you know what support that you have.
Yep.
Right? And that is when you walk in, or on Zoom now, because
Because COVID.
but that you do your research, right?
Yeah.
And you look at the school district and you look at their policies.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we had a policy basically that says, we are going to back our students, and students have, like, the right to their blah, blah,
Right.
blah. And then we were like, yeah, but you know what, you guys are, right? And then the teachers union, that's what they put up in their thing.
Yep.
So you shouldn't have to do this, but I would say you need to do this, particularly as a new teacher.
Yeah.
To make sure, because it's hard to make your mark on that first job, right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
go in and you're still learning.
Yeah.
And so I would say that it's all in the interviewing process.
Mm-hmm.
And this is for everybody, but particularly so that you know where the agency, the school district stands.
Yep.
And you know what your support is.
Yeah.
That's gonna make the difference, because it is hard to start out in a new job
Yes.
and then to have to, not to say that you can't be the one that forges the way, because somebody has to be.
Someone does.
But,
If you don't want to be that person, also no judgment.
well, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because, so to know, and at least go in knowing that this is going to be my fight. Shouldn't have to be my fight. But to know what it is.
Yeah.
So if you look at the school districts and you say, well, you know what? I wanna go to this one because I look and I see that they're great champions, right? Or if you say, well, you know what? This one's had some issues, but they're working on it, then I know what it is. The issue is when I go in and I get blindsided.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
So go in knowing and having some forethought as to what you'll do.
Yep. Yeah, and I would, there's like a TikTok out, and it's like huge on lesbian TikTok, right? I love TikTok. It's like the most source of most stress and most fun in my life. I just hit 10.4K followers. Pretty much all I do is be sassy to like transphobic and homophobic people. It's like great. It's like my personality on TikTok. But on lesbian TikTok, there's that sound effect where it's like, are you? That's like, are you? And it's like, like lesbians pointing each other out in public, right? Don't be afraid to talk to another queer person too at the agency that you're applying for. Like if you see someone who's out and proud, don't always confuse people's written mission, vision, and values with how that plays out. Because our school had a mission, vision, and values that should have prohibited. My wife said lesbian TikTok is the best. We had a mission, vision, values in place that should have prohibited these instances of hate speech multiple times coming from two different administrators. Our mission, vision, and values should have protected our students, and it didn't. So don't be afraid to really examine the fabric of the place you're working and take a mental inventory of if you can afford to work there. Because if you don't have the bandwidth at that time, I am never going to blame someone for protecting themselves. But if you have the bandwidth and like kind of a little chip on your attitude, like I'm here and queer, that's you have a chance to make a difference in the world too. And sometimes even just if you're just exist as a queer person, you create space for other queer people to exist around you. Just as someone who is like biracial or you know, like from a different religious background, just by them existing, you create space for other people to exist. So if you have the bandwidth, you know, evaluate your bandwidth and evaluate the culture of the agency and see if the two match up, you know, and don't be afraid to. It's real scary getting like your first like big kid job. It's terrifying. I work for myself now because I understand how terrifying it was, okay? But evaluate it and don't be afraid to take your self-efficacy and worth into consideration when you kind of weigh that decision out, you know? That'd be my advice. So as someone who never had the privilege of being cisgender or who looking straight, everybody knew I was a lesbian before I did, which is like really unfortunate because I wish they could have clued me in. But you know, even as someone who like never had the advantage of looking straight, I definitely know how that can sort of affect you. So I've never passed as heterosexual. It's like, whoopsies. Do you guys have other questions? Do you want me to answer some of these, or do you think we're good?
Those are their questions we did, yeah.
All right. The most rewarding part of my job, the most rewarding part of who I am right now is the interaction with people that it affords me. I kind of steer my own ship right now. And so, like, am I a hairdresser? Am I a theologian? Am I a clothing designer? This is my current clothing line. Yes, like I am all of those things. But the most rewarding part of being who I am is that I get to give people space to exist wherever I am and whatever I do. And that's because I bring who I am to the table in whatever aspect I'm at. And because I don't have to worry about being fired, I can like be me as loudly as I want. So I actually did just start designing clothes. My brand name is Heretic Apparel. And I just started designing clothes because I wanted to. And because people already refer to me as a heretic all the time on TikTok. Like, the word heretic is probably the number one most used comment on my TikTok. What heretic just means someone who like goes against what the establishment says. But I created that space because like I can just be myself loudly. And one of the first shirts I made was like, I am queer, sometimes loudly. I also might add that I'm unapologetic for that. So that's the most rewarding thing about crafting the space that I have in my life. Dealing with hate on social media. I'm going to teach a master course on that because I have been told to Jill myself a million times on TikTok. Because if you say Jill instead of kill, you won't get docked by the algorithm. So people tell me to Jill myself all the time. People just are constantly being like, have you ever read the Bible? So me dealing with hate on social media, I have a great counselor. I've been in counseling for like 12 years. It's fantastic. I take some anti-anxiety medicine. I may or may not take some edibles. Then I just literally let it roll off my back because if I can exist and kind of push back against the haters, even if it's with just ridiculous sass intermixed with real religious knowledge, I can create a little bit safer of a space. So that's how I deal with hate. If anything gets outright hateful or is like an attack, I just don't deal with that. I kind of learned a long time ago that just do not give any attention to the cheap seats. If someone is going to be awful to you no matter what, and they're not approaching a conversation with good intention, don't give them your energy. And that's a self-preservation method that I had to draw on to survive as a person who exists outside a category, right? If someone comes to me with a good intention, like any of your questions have been fantastic. If someone approached me with like any of your questions in real life, I would know their intention was good. And so I would give them my intellectual space and energy. If someone comes at me and is just being a jackwagon, get out of here. I will no longer engage with debates because I don't care. I know who I am and I know what I am, and I have a vision for the world that I'm trying to make, and I'm not going to coddle anybody, or I'm not going to curb who I am. And so if you're there because you want to have a conversation with me, okay. But 9 times out of 10, people come to a debate not to have their opinion changed. They come to change yours. And so I've decided that I'm not giving my energy to that crowd. And that goes with the same on social media. If I can tell we're having a conversation, yes. If I can tell you're on the bubble and you need some information that I might have, yes. If you're just being a jerk, no. Sorry. Get out of my life. So how do you navigate LGBTQ youth whose parents are unaccepting because of religion and etc.? My family was very unaccepting to begin with. I came from a conservative Christian world where it was just a no. Funny story. You've all heard me now for however long we've been in here. You can probably tell that I don't really sound heterosexual or like really male or really female, right? So I've always, existed outside of the binary. And that was really, really difficult to begin with, especially in the world of religion. But my family initially cut me off. But then just this past year, my mom actually apologized to me for everything she did while I was coming out. And she said, I've never not loved you, and I handled it poorly, and I am so incredibly sorry. My mom, if you know the Jill, she's a great woman. She does not apologize. And she did apologize. And so I think that experience with her really taught me a lot. And a couple of those things are things I like to pass on, especially to youth who are coming out, which is you get to control the setting in which you come out. When I came out, I was several states away from my parents because I did not think it would go well, so I came out on the phone. It went terribly. Glad I was a couple states away. But I also, while making that decision about when I came out, I also got to decide what I wanted my relationship with my parents to be. And that's something in case you guys needed to know this, I'm going to give you this information right now. You get to decide your relationship with your parents. You don't owe them anything at this point in your life. If you want them in your life and it's healthy for you, you can keep them. If you don't want them in your life and it's not healthy, you can eat them. You have options, right? But I try to explain this to LGBTQ youth in particular, is you get to choose when you come out and how you come out. And you get to choose how people deal with you. And so if you have parents that you don't think are going to respond well, it is absolutely fair to stay in the closet or to come out in a way that provides you with distance, be it physical distance or emotional distance. That's kind of the biggest thing, is that you get to control your narrative. Sometimes your narrative means busting out of a rainbow cake with flags on, right? Or sometimes your narrative means like keeping a low profile until you have a safety net. And that's the most important thing, I think, for youth, especially if you're going to be in a social work setting talking to a youth. I would definitely try to make sure they have a crisis plan set up, make sure they have support set up, make sure they have all of those pieces in place. So, yeah. And I would like to add, too, that I just had my mom on my podcast this year, and I decided I wanted her in my life. And so she wanted me in her life. And so we're making that work. And it's like sometimes just crazy. But she came on for Mother's Day, and we talked about what it's like to love each other across sort of a difference. And it was really cool. We talked about all the things that bring us together instead of what separates us. So she's doing as much important work as I am, I would say. So that's how I handle that. But with youth, it's you get to control your narrative. You get to control when you come out. Make sure you're safe first, basically. Does the government provide insurance coverage for sex change surgery and hormone therapy, or is there no coverage typically? It is completely dependent on your insurance. I think our healthcare system is like a hot mess in America, and there's really no one equitable answer. The one answer I can say is that 9 times out of 10, most insurance and medical procedures are like full of a lot of gatekeeping. So there is a long way to go, and no, it's not federally required that trans identity is like validated or even cared for. There are some things that cisgender people qualify for federally that we can never qualify for. So that's a really important thing. It's kind of similar to the relationship that our federal government has to marijuana legalization, right? It's legal some places, it's not legal other places. Some places it's medically legal. And that sort of illustrates the problem of needing some federal guidance. And I think it's similar in my estimation with healthcare and trans healthcare. There's just no federal oversight. So South Carolina can be like, let's burn you with, like pitchforks. And then New York State can be like, hey, we'll give you health care. But I believe, as of the last time I checked, only 5 states were required to give you health care, access to health care as a trans person. So How often does misgendering or offensive comments come up, and how do you deal with this? I don't, because I am non-binary and I exist in a binary society, I've had to make a decision in my life about how I was going to deal with misgendering. What I have decided is that I'm going to assume good intention until someone proves otherwise. That's my decision. I have to make that disclaimer because trans people don't owe anybody anything. Just like black people do not owe white people an explanation of what it's like to experience racism. You can Google that shit, okay? So not everybody owes you this, but this is my personal stance. I don't assume ill intention until someone proves that they're, full of malice. Like we have like a local pastor who likes to come at me all the time publicly and misgender me and talk about me and say that I'm hateful and violent and full of anger and I'm leading the world astray. This person does it over social media and they literally screamed over top of me when I was speaking at a board meeting. That, my friends, is ill intention. And I don't have time for that. Full stop, fully annoyed, fully whatever. But unless someone comes at me with ill intention, I assume that they're coming to the table to have a conversation. So I am fine with like he, him pronouns. I'm not offended. I understand I live in a binary society. And I don't automatically correct people. I'll tell them if they ask or if we have the rapport for that conversation. But that's me because I have a counselor and some bandwidth. Not everybody has that ability to speak or want to speak. So that's kind of how I handle it. Does that make sense? Cool. This is similar, a question about pronouns. Is it offensive to you if people slip up or correct themselves? I actually think if someone is correcting themselves when they use like when they use he, him for me, I think they're more embarrassed than I am. And so I try to honestly just assure people that I was not taking any ill offense if you did not mean it. Really, the only time I'm offended is when people literally go the extra mile to call me she, her, because like it's not an honest mistake. I honestly don't have a question. I really love the integrity that this person had. Someone's enrolled in queer theory. That's so cool. I'm currently enrolled in queer theory, which we discuss the LGBTQIA community and how this community is perceived and understood in modern society. In your opinion, which institutions, legal, educational, etc., are lacking in terms of ensuring protection and rights for LGBTQ individuals? Do you have any suggestions that those institutions could use or change? There is. It's just really spotty, honestly. There are some institutions that are fantastic. There are some institutions that are toilet water. You just don't know. And I think that's part of sort of that overarching federal conversation that would benefit our society. But we literally can't still agree that racism exists. So I don't know if transgender rights are the first thing on the table. But I think that there is... I think that like a federal affirmation of personhood for transgender and policy that would help us. Hi, Mom. We need federal legislation and policy that would be like an overarching umbrella protection from which things would come downwards. I'm not a fan of like trickle-down economics, but I definitely do think in terms of policy setting, as the United States, our legal body is the federal government and then the state governments and then the local governments. And so I think we need some sort of federal conversation around protecting the rights of vulnerable people, right? Trans people being one of those, but certainly not the only. So... did that answer my question? You don't have to out yourself, but if it was yours, just like wink at me. But I think that would really help a lot, honestly, because that would at least set the tone of the conversation instead of just debating if I exist. People all the time look at me and they're like, "You can't be gay and a Christian," and I'm like you can argue what you want to do with it, but you can't argue that I exist. And I think that's the step that we need to take federally is stopping to argue if people who are different exist and just figuring out what now. You know what I mean? Because I exist. Like what you want to do with that is on you, but I exist. So when did you first know you wanted to transition? Do you feel like you have always known this is who you're supposed to be? Do you believe that there is a benchmark age that may be too young? I don't think there is ever an age that is too young to discuss identity. And I don't think that just has to do with genitals. I don't think that just has to do with do your clothes have a piece of fabric in the middle or not? Skirt versus pants. I think you should, as parents and as people who work with children, like, that's the beauty of growing up, is you're literally becoming who you are. I think that sometimes people view life as this, you've got to figure out who you are. But I really think that a lot of life is figuring out who you already were. And I think that if we didn't push norms on our kids, they wouldn't have to find their way back. They'd just live into them. And so I don't think it's ever too young to have a conversation about identity with kids, ever. I mean, it's not like I'm talking to my kid about who do you want to have sex with, and they're 3. I'm having a conversation about what they like and don't like. I'm having a conversation about consent. I'm having a conversation about healthy relationships, how you relate with other people. All of those conversations are real and they happen in real time, and they all have to do with someone's identity. So people have just sort of stigmatized gender and orientation. So that's my thought on that. I feel like, now this is a weird thing in terms of wanted to transition. When I was little, like 3, 4, 5, I remember crying and praying to God, asking why I wasn't a boy. But I've come to the conclusion that I would have been so confused if I was born a boy. Like, I would have been like, I like women, but like, I'm not a dude, but like, I look like a dude, and I like looking like a dude. Like, I would have just been so confused. I feel that I was born who I needed to be, and I'm becoming the fullness of who I'm supposed to be, if that makes sense. Because for me, I understand myself to be a non-binary person, and I think being born, like, as a societally described cisgender male would have just been so confusing. Because I would have been like a cis male that's like, I'm a lesbian, and people would have been like, what? You know what I mean? And so I think that in that way, I needed to be born assigned female at birth to become Leo, if that makes sense. Now, that is not to say that my experience is normative, because when you've talked to one trans person, you've talked to exactly one trans person. Just like when you've talked to one black person, you've talked to exactly one black person. When you talk to one person, indigenous person, you've talked to exactly one indigenous person. But that's my experience. So I knew from a very young age I was different. But I didn't really understand it until I started to have the language about being non-binary. The most challenging part of my transition was definitely accessing gender-affirming ID. That was terrible. There's just no one repository for name change in our country. So even if you're a cisgendered female, changing your name, you have to change it everywhere you have a legal tie. Banks, car loans, cell phone bills, insurance. It literally took me 5 years to change my name on my insurance. And I was in the hospital literally with sepsis and my organs were shutting down. And the only reason that insurance got it taken care of was because the hospital wanted to make sure that they got paid for my insurance. So they sent a liaison to talk to the insurance company. I was on oxygen and I had to call my insurance company to get them to change my name so that the hospital could get their money. This poor woman from the finance department was not a social worker, but she did so well. But that was super, super challenging.
I was going to say, I actually have a 60-year-old female who is female,
Yeah.
who got married
Yeah.
and wants to change her name.
Yep.
But she has to get her birth certificate, and she was adopted, and they're not sure, right?
Yep.
And so you add all these layers,
Yeah.
and that is without even adding having to prove what sex you are.
Literally.
Right? Like, she can't change her name and on her social security until she gets, like, we can't even figure out, like, which town she was born in.
Yep.
We have to have her adoption
Yep.
certificate.
Yeah, and if that's sealed, yeah. And then let's add another kink to that. Let's add immigration status.
Oh.
Because you could have been born in the United States, but if you don't have a green card, which is like not really a thing, but if you don't have your citizenship and proof of your citizenship, you can never get a license. You cannot get federal aid. Like, there are all these things you can't do, and you would have lived here your whole life. That's another really important issue that we don't talk enough about is immigration status. So, but yeah, it's just super challenging just to change your name. And then if you add any area of marginalization onto that, it's just it really makes you want to drink. So someone asked when I knew I went on to transition. We covered that. Someone asked, how did you decide on a new name? My family literally named me. My wife and kids named me. They've always called me Leo from day one, so it was just so natural for me. Do you think it's easier at a younger or older age to transition? I think it would have been easier at a younger age, with the caveat of I don't think it would have been transitioning. I think it would have just been becoming. And I think that's the ideal of where I would hope to see the world go. You know what I mean? It's just letting our kids become at an earlier age without any sort of regard for our own ego in it. Just letting our kids become who they are instead of having to find their way back to it later. That's kind of how I view it. How do you create a relationship with a difficult, stubborn, or off-putting client? That's really, really hard because when you're dealing with someone who is, so I'll give you 2 examples. As a queer person distributing services, if the person that I'm working with it just doesn't just like recognize my personhood, that would be incredibly difficult. And I would probably have to request a case change. But if that person is queer and they do not know that I am queer, they might have attitudes or whatever towards me that like, this person is just going to write me off. This person is not going to understand. And so in that instance, that's how I meter when I disclose my like orientation and gender in a professional setting. I meter how and when I disclose based on like the needs of the client. And so I have experienced this before where it was actually when I was working as a pastor, and I knew that there was a student that like specifically needed like pastoral social work, if you will, because being a pastor is pretty much just being a social worker like with religion involved. But that's how I meter disclosure. And that's actually why I left the last religious job that I was ever on the books for, was because I knew that there was a queer student who needed to hear my story. And I couldn't say it at that job. So, but if I sense that that's why a client is being difficult, I will absolutely disclose to build rapport with them. That's the best way to build rapport with the client, and even with difficult individuals. I was at a protest this past year with this just sweet old woman whose hair I cut, and she is so funny. She's got to be in her 70s or 80s. And we were out at a protest for Black Lives Matter in the square in Olean. It's as big of a shit show as you would imagine. One time we had someone yell, "Kill yourselves!" But then literally 2 seconds later, they ran into the median and like screwed their car up. So that was like instant karma. But this is the attitude we're working with. And this person, Marianne, is out there and she's just going like this. I was like, "Marianne, like, do you want to sign?" She's like, "No, I like waving." I was like, "Okay." And she's like, "It's much harder for them to yell at you if you're smiling and waving." And I think I learned a lot from her that day about how to deal with stubborn people, because if you just build rapport with them and you make that connection, it's a lot harder for them to just be a jerk to you. So I learned a lot from Marianne that day, let's say. As a transgender person, do you think it'd be easier to come out living in a rural area, or would it be more difficult? Does where you live make it easier or harder? Quick note on this, I am in no way shaming anybody, so please don't feel that way. Someone just wrote, as a transgender, do you think it would be easier? Blah, 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 whatever. So in general, transgender is an adjective. It's not a noun. So like, I'm not a transgender, I'm a person of transgender experience. That's something you'll probably hear a lot in the social work world, is using person-centered language. So a person isn't defined by whatever category you're using. That's like, they're not a disabled person, they're a person with a disability. They're not a homeless person, they're a person experiencing homelessness. It's a way to validate someone's personhood beyond the circumstance that you meet them in. So just like a friendly note, like maybe try to use that person-centered language, especially like in practice, but even in real life. And yeah, transgender is an adjective, not a noun. So like, I'm not a gay, I'm a gay person kind of a thing, if that makes sense. So no shade on you, just like a fun literary tip for you to take into your work. But as a trans person, I was really terrified to come out here. 100%. And if I'm being intellectually honest, it went better than I thought it would. It was not without strife, but I think Olean is a unique place, because I think the Olean, kind of how we talked about the transgender tipping point, I think Olean is at a cultural tipping point. Weirdly enough, how many of you guys are from areas that are bigger than Olean? Anyone? Okay, it's hella small here, right? 13,000 people, right? But weirdly enough, get this, wrap your mind around this census data, because I love census data. We are the cultural center of our county. We are the biggest town for, like, in some cases, like, more almost 2 hours around us. We are the cultural center. Is that not horrifying to you guys? Horrifying. But it puts us at a cool place socially, because we're actually at a tipping point. We are literally a cultural leader in our area, and we are a small town, but we put on a Black Lives Matter protest that had over 300 people there that literally Barack Obama retweeted about. So in that way, I say that small town America is America. And according to the LGBTQ rural map, which is a study, you can look it up, the number of LGBTQ Americans living in small town America is 2 to 3 million. So there are plenty of rural queers out there. It's just sort of like the narrative of coming out is that you have to go to the cities, but you don't. I mean, I have a friend who is a non-binary lesbian, and she lives in Arkansas with her partner, and she's just like, I'm the lesbian non-binary farmer, and that's just normal for her. So I thought it was going to be hard, but coming out here, I realized that small town America is America, and gay people are in small town America. So it was easier than I thought it was going to be. I would say that it was harder in some ways to do it here than it would be in a city, but I think it was easier in some ways to do it here than it would be in a city because people just knew me as me, you know? So it's a both and, if that makes sense. But that LGBTQ rural map is really cool. If you're a social worker, I would encourage you to look it up. It talks about LGBTQ rural Americans and the barriers that they face to service acquisition. So it's really, really helpful for social workers. Actually, my non-binary lesbian farmer friend told me about that in our class where we talked about how there were 20,000 queer species of animals. It all comes full circle, folks. Is it hard to live in a small conservative town and be trans? Do you face struggles specifically because you live in a small town? I do face struggles because I live in a small town. A lot of those are not exclusive to me being trans. They're exclusive to me being in an area categorized by rural poverty. When you get into social work, especially if you look at public health, which is actually like a very interesting field. I just happened to volunteer with a public health group in town, and I found out a lot about built environment and how there are specific struggles that come along with rural poverty that really, really can be problematic, including distributing services. How do you get to people who are in the middle of the woods and can't get to you? And how do you make that work with like literally no funding? Because let's face it, the field of social work is not funded well, but it is one of the most important fields ever. So some of my struggles are not unique to me being trans. They're more tied to like my class and my geographic location, if that makes sense. And I wouldn't say it can be hard, especially because of like finding doctors and some maybe entrenched attitudes. But I will say this, I have like the dopest life ever. And I'm living my absolute fullest truth at every second right here in Olean. And like Olean might not always be ready for that, but you know they got to claim me because I keep showing up in city council meetings. I keep showing up at school board meetings. So they just can't like push me aside, you know? So I think there are times where it's hard. There are times that it's hard because I am so public and visible. But there are also times where people stop me at the drive-thru at Dunkin' Donuts over here across from campus, and they look at me with tears in their eyes, and they're like, I saw your video responding to that pastor, and I have to say thank you because I've never once heard a person affirm my identity from a religious perspective. And those moments literally make everything else so worth it. Yeah, it's really... I'm living my fullest truth, and I just decided it was going to be an Olean, so, like, sorry for you, Olean, but I was just going to be my fullest self, and I'm not going to wait at some point in the future to actualize. I'm just going to do it here and see where that takes me, you know? Those are all your questions. Did you have any other questions, or you think, like, you good? Did I bore you to death? Are you tired? Do you hate me? Did I make you scared about going into the real world? I'm gonna pass it back over to you, friend, but I would just like to throw out there that my offer to be accessible extends beyond the classroom. This is just kind of part of the fabric of who I am and what I do in the world. And so if you'd like to speak to me at all, feel free to contact me on social media. If you want to find me on Facebook, you can look up Leowt. That's my business page, but it's way easier to remember how to spell that than how to spell my last names. So you can look up Leowt on Facebook. You can find me on Insta as Leowt, and on TikTok, if you search the hashtag Leowt, you'll find me, or you can look up spiritually NB Leowt, which stands for spiritually non-binary Leowt. So I don't think you can message right away on Facebook or on TikTok. I think there's some sort of thing where you have to both be friends, and it's really hard to keep up with my follows because I'm getting so many. So if you want to message me, TikTok might not be your best, but feel free to message me on Insta or Facebook. I should be pretty visible, so it's an extended offer. So take it up if you want.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.